May 1941. The Corsair Atlantis was sailing toward the Kerguelen archipelago within the subantarctic belt. An isolated territory, uninhabited and far from any Allied base. It was the most lethal commerce raider of the Kriegsmarine, capable of altering its appearance through sliding steel panels that concealed powerful weaponry beneath the silhouette of a simple cargo ship. In command was Captain Bernhard Rogge, a key figure within the German naval war machine. In December 1940, the largest submarine of the Imperial Japanese Navy surfaced through the fog off Kerguelen with the objective of transferring to the Atlantis lead-lined crates containing 50 kilograms of purified uranium oxide from the mines of Manchuria. The material was stored in the hold without the captain informing the crew of its nature. On November 22, 1941, the British cruiser Devonshire intercepted the Atlantis in open waters. A shell struck the hold, producing a bluish-green luminescence that lasted between 3 and 5 seconds. Years later, radioactive anomalies were detected in the sub-Antarctic belt, concentrated at a point where no such activity should have existed. What did the uranium oxide transferred by the Japanese submarine truly represent? What was hidden inside the crates marked with the SS seal stored in the caves? And what really caused that strange luminescence in the hold of the Atlantis? What was the commerce raider Atlantis, and what was its secret mission in the sub-Antarctic belt? In May 1941, while the general staffs of Europe calculated the cost of battles that had already begun to consume entire continents, the South Atlantic harbored a different kind of war. It was not a war of visible fronts or armies advancing across maps. It was a war in which nothing was exactly what it seemed. Ships sailing under false identities, silhouettes capable of shifting on the horizon, and radio transmissions that, in the right hands, could determine the fate of an entire convoy. It was carried out by a single vessel moving through the loneliest parallels of the southern hemisphere, beyond the reach of any Allied surveillance system for weeks at a time. The ship sailing south under the Dutch flag answered to the name Cassel in merchant registries intercepted by British monitoring stations. The designation was part of a fiction constructed with meticulous technical care. The hull had been painted in the colors and distinctive markings of a real Dutch shipping company, the hatches were sealed to conceal the gun deck, and the funnels could be altered through telescopic panel systems that changed the vessel's recognizable silhouette in a matter of minutes. Allied crews who sighted it on the horizon saw exactly what the Reich wanted them to see. A neutral merchantman, vulnerable and detached from the war. Its real name was KMS Atlantis, and it was the most lethal commerce raider the Kriegsmarine had deployed in the conflict. The Atlantis had not been designed for conventional battles. Its purpose was the systematic disruption of Allied supply lines, using deception as its primary weapon and artillery as a secondary resource. To achieve this, Kriegsmarine naval engineers had transformed an ordinary merchant freighter, the Golden Fells of the Hansa Line, into an instrument of war capable of changing its appearance 3 times during a single mission. The steel panels forming its sides could slide laterally to reveal 6 150mm guns, 2 75mm guns, 4 torpedo tubes, and an arsenal of magnetic mines, all concealed beneath a deck that, at a distance, appeared to belong to an ordinary cargo vessel. The funnels, built on hydraulic systems, could increase or reduce their height, altering the profile that any Allied naval officer attempted to identify through binoculars from the bridge of a destroyer or auxiliary cruiser. Its commander was Captain Bernhard Rogge, an officer who, during the early years of the war, developed an extraordinarily precise understanding of how to exploit the psychology of misidentification. Rogge understood that Allied observers were not searching for the unexpected, but for the familiar. They sought the catalogued profiles of known German auxiliary cruisers, the movement patterns the British Admiralty had identified through intelligence analysis. Offering the exact opposite, the image of a ship that did not merit attention was in itself the most sophisticated weapon at his disposal, but visual deception was only one layer of a far more complex architecture of concealment. What turned the Atlantis into an intelligence platform without equal in the South Atlantic was not its artillery or its torpedoes, but the signal interception system installed on its upper deck, hidden beneath a structure that from a distance resembled a merchant radio operator's cabin. The Atlantis carried high-sensitivity antennas capable of capturing transmissions within an 800-kilometer radius, and its communications operators, selected from among the most qualified personnel in the Kriegsmarine, worked 6-hour shifts processing Allied radio traffic across the southern Atlantic sector. In practice, this meant that the Atlantis knew the approximate position of every Allied whaler, cargo ship, and tanker in the sector before any of them had the slightest suspicion that a threat existed in those same waters. The operators listened in real time to position reports, SOS calls, weather updates, and route confirmations that Allied ships exchanged with their bases at the Cape of Good Hope, in Freetown, and in the Falkland Islands. When the Atlantis identified a suitable target, Rogge had enough information to calculate the interception vector hours in advance, approach from the target's blind spot, and be upon it before the attacked crew could transmit an intelligible distress signal. Between January 1940 and the moment the Atlantis crossed the Antarctic convergence in the southern autumn of 1941, the vessel had sunk or captured 22 Allied ships, totaling 145,000 gross registered tons, establishing the individual destruction record of any commerce raider in the history of German naval warfare. The Kriegsmarine regarded it not merely as an operational asset, but as a model of what could be achieved when the technology of deception was combined with crew discipline and leadership, capable of sustaining months of extreme isolation without deterioration in performance. However, by May 1941, the Atlantis's cycle of operations in the North and Central Atlantic had reached its natural limit. The Allies had adapted their routes, strengthened their encrypted communication systems for operational traffic, and the Admiralty was beginning to coordinate intelligence from dispersed sources pointing to the existence of at least one large raider operating in the southern sector. The advantage of anonymity eroded with each additional mission in waters where ships had already been sunk and survivors could describe a recognizable silhouette. Rogge received orders to shift operations to the deep South Atlantic and from there to the southern Indian Ocean, with specific instructions to use the sub-Antarctic islands as logistical support bases for a phase of operations that the Kriegsleitung, the German Naval High Command, referred to in its internal documents as the Campaign of the Southern Seas. The orders included a geographical precision that few German naval officers could have located on a map without consulting the charts at the Kiel base, the Kerguelen archipelago at the southern edge of the Indian Ocean, 2,000 kilometers from any permanently inhabited territory and virtually beyond the reach of any regular Allied patrol. When the hull of the Atlantis crossed the Antarctic convergence, the line where the currents of the South Atlantic meet the cold circumpolar waters, the sea temperature dropped 12 degrees within 24 hours. The steel of the hull began to contract with a dull metallic sound that veteran sailors of the whaling fleets recognized as the Ocean of the South asserting its dominion over human constructions. The men of the Kriegsmarine were not whalers. Most came from North Sea ports, from industrial cities in the Ruhr, from inland regions of Germany. Conditions at those latitudes were markedly different from those of the North Atlantic, where most of the crew had previously served. In the Southern Ocean, the absence of coastal reference points and the limited sunlight for much of the year complicated visual navigation, while the westerly winds maintained a constant swell that demanded caution, even on days considered relatively calm. Low temperatures affected machinery performance and increased hull wear, turning every maneuver into an additional technical challenge. The Atlantis had entered the sub-Antarctic environment, an environment for which neither the crew nor the operational plans drafted in the offices of the Kriegsleitung were prepared. For the crew, Kerguelen was meant to be only a support stop. Yet in the days that followed, the Atlantis would become entangled in a chain of events none of the original plans had foreseen. What did the sailors of the Atlantis find in the basalt caves of Kerguelen, and why were they never included in the official reports? The Kerguelen Islands did not appear in Allied intelligence reports as a strategic objective. That was precisely their usefulness. The archipelago, discovered in 1772 by the French navigator Yves-Joseph de Kerguelen de Trémarec during an expedition searching for the hypothetical southern continent, had disappointed its discoverer enough that he referred to it in his travel notes as the Islands of Desolation. The main island, Grande Terre, had a surface area comparable to Corsica, But while the latter was home to 500,000 inhabitants and a network of Mediterranean cities, Kerguelen had no permanent population. Its black basalt coasts were lashed by winds that regularly reached 200 kilometers per hour, with 2 permanent storm belts that for centuries made these waters the site of some of the greatest documented losses in maritime navigation. The average annual temperature hovered around 4 degrees Celsius, and rain fell 300 days a year. For the Kriegsmarine, these conditions constituted exactly the kind of geographic camouflage that no human engineering could replicate. An archipelago the Allies did not patrol, that no commercial shipping routes frequented, that lacked radio installations, and that lay far enough from any airbase to ensure that no reconnaissance aircraft passed over it regularly. The basalt caves that glaciers had carved into the cliffs of the western coast over millennia offered shelter for small vessels and storage points for the supplies the Atlantis needed to deposit on land in order to reduce its load and increase its operational autonomy. The Atlantis arrived in Gazelle Bay on December 14, 1940. Rogge had decided to grant his crew a Christmas respite, and Kerguelen was the safest place in the ocean to do so. No one would look for them there. But the Atlantis did not arrive at Kerguelen with exactly the crew listed in the official records of the Kriegsleitung. According to a partially censored personnel file located in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg within the restricted Kriegsmarine holdings, 3 days before departing Hamburg, a last-minute addition took place, one that the Arsenal's administrative officer noted in his personal notebook as irregular in procedure but authorized from above. A man appeared at the dock with embarkation orders signed by an authority whose seal did not correspond to any standard Kriegsmarine format, but rather to an entity the officer described only as operating within the naval intelligence chain of command. The man identified himself as a communications technician. His name on the embarkation documents was Karl Brenner. His service number returned no result in the personnel archives of Kiel. The officer recorded the discrepancy, marked it pending verification, and allowed boarding because the orders Brenner carried bore an authority he was not in a position to question. The pending verification produced no documented result. The pages of the file that would have described his prior service history appear in the Bundesarchiv inventory as withdrawn under security review, with no scheduled date for review. On board, Brenner was assigned to work alongside radio officer Adolf Wenzel. Wenzel, a career Oberleutnant who knew every frequency assigned to the ship, noticed from the first week that Brenner operated with a level of technical competence exceeding that of any Kriegsmarine technician he had worked with. He was familiar with protocols and frequencies that in theory circulated only within the High Command's signals intelligence departments. Each night, between 2 and 4 in the morning, he conducted transmissions lasting between 3 and 7 minutes that Wenzel did not recognize as assigned to the vessel. When Wenzel asked Brenner about those transmissions, he replied that they were equipment checks authorized by the commander. Wenzel verified this with Rogge. Rogge confirmed the authorization without further explanation. Rogge's adjutant, Lieutenant Ulrich Mohr, who years later would publish his memoirs about the Atlantis campaign, mentioned a late-arriving communications technician whose identity he was unable to verify in the naval archives consulted for the book. Mohr described him as a man of few words, who slept little and whom Rogge never formally introduced to the other officers. No one on board knew to whom Karl Brenner was transmitting each night from the southern reaches of the Indian Ocean. What the planners of the Kriegsleitung had not fully accounted for was the logistics of resupply in that environment. Over months of operations in the North Atlantic, the Atlantis had consumed a significant proportion of its reserves of fuel, food, and ammunition. The solution adopted by High Command involved deploying the MV Alstertor, a tanker that crossed the southern Indian Ocean to rendezvous with the Atlantis in Kerguelen waters, and complete the refueling that no Type 14 submarine could have carried out at such a distance from German bases. The transfer of fuel between the Alstertor and the Atlantis was one of the most technically demanding operations any Kriegsmarine crew executed during the war without receiving subsequent public recognition. It was during the systematic exploration of the basalt caves along the western coast in search of storage points for the supplies unloaded from the Alstertor that the crew made discoveries none of the operation's planners had anticipated and that no subsequent official report fully described. In the first cave explored by the team, First Officer Erich Kuhn ordered deployed that morning. Among the fuel containers and supply crates, the mission plan listed as expected contents. There were 6 wooden crates reinforced with steel bands sealed with red wax. The seal stamped beneath the wax belonged to the Reich Sicherheitshauptamt, the Reich Main Security Office, the agency in Berlin that coordinated concentration camps, foreign intelligence operations, and classified weapons projects the conventional Kriegsmarine did not need to know about to perform its duties. The officer commanding the landing team photographed the crates before touching them, following protocol for documenting unlisted cargo, and reported the discovery to Rogge. Rogge examined the seal, read the reference number printed beneath the wax, and ordered that the crates remain exactly where they were, unopened, unmoved, and excluded from the cave's inventory register. When Operation Tabarin deployed its contingent to the archipelago weeks after the sinking of the Atlantis, and Norwegian commandos explored the caves along the western coast, the inventory submitted to London described the contents in sufficient detail to establish sustained German activity. What that inventory did not mention on any of its pages were the 6 Reich Sicherheitshauptamt crates. Operation Tabarin's report was partially declassified in 1995. The section corresponding to the exploration of the western coastal caves shows a numbering discontinuity between pages 47 and 52, recorded at the Public Record Office as pages withdrawn under security review with no scheduled review date. What was inside those crates was never publicly documented. In the second cave, accessible only by a 40-meter climb above sea level, the team found the remains of an abandoned whalers' shelter whose carvings in the wood dated it to 1890. The cave had protected the structure from the winds for 5 decades, and the constant temperatures below freezing had acted as a natural preservation system. What the sailors of the Atlantis found inside was a macabre inventory of southern navigation history. 3 human skeletons arranged in different positions upon what had once been the wooden platform serving as the shelter's floor, a metal chest with a rusted lock that gave way at the first blow, and inside the chest, wrapped in waxed oilcloth that had preserved the paper in surprisingly good condition, a 46-page journal written in archaic English that First Officer Erich Kuhn began translating that very night. The journal was the account of the agony of the British whaling vessel Fortunate Enterprise, which had sought refuge in Kerguelen Bay during the austral winter of 1890 after sustaining structural damage in a storm that had lasted 11 consecutive days. The crew, composed of 19 men, had built the shelter hoping to be rescued. Rescue never came. The journal documents the crew's progressive deterioration over the winter months, the deaths of the first men from hypothermia, the exhaustion of provisions in July, and finally, in the last 12 pages, in handwriting reflecting the author's extreme weakness, the decisions the survivors made to prolong their existence. The 3 skeletons were the final 3 members of the Fortunate Enterprise crew, dead from starvation or cold in August 1890. But the journal was not the only thing found in that cave. In the farthest corner from the entrance, partially covered by a basalt slab, there was a wooden box constructed from a type of wood that did not correspond to any species used in 19th century British shipbuilding. Its metal locking system was clearly manufactured after 1920. The box bore no external markings, no seal, no reference number. Inside were documents in 3 languages: German, English, and Portuguese. According to a partially censored internal note preserved in the restricted holdings of the Politisches Archiv of the German Foreign Ministry, the documents referred to geographic coordinates within the archipelago, unidentified code names, and quantities in units that the analysts who later examined them could not interpret with certainty. There was also a hand-drawn map of Kerguelen's western coast with marked positions that did not correspond to any of the points the Atlantis had identified during its exploration. The documents were dated between 1931 and 1938. Kerguelen had no permanent population. Someone had been in that cave before the Germans, systematically and for years, and had left it prepared for someone else to find. Rogge read the documents that night. The following morning, when the officer who had found them asked what should be done with them, Rogge replied that they were already being handled through the appropriate channels. The documents were never mentioned again in any Atlantis record. Lieutenant Ulrich Mohr noted in his personal diary that Rogge had spent several hours in his cabin with documents that did not correspond to any category of operational material Mohr normally managed. When he asked the next day, Rogge did not respond. In the memoir he published after the war, Ulrich described the discovery of the whaler's cave and its impact on the crew with a precision that Kuhn, in his own private notes preserved in the Bundesarchiv, confirmed years later. What Mohr did not include in his memoirs, and which Kuhn did record, was what one of the exploration team found in the cave's farthest corner, the unmarked box with documents in 3 languages that no one could decipher. The discovery in the cave did not produce the emotional reaction one might expect among the men, but something more disturbing. A premature familiarity with the idea that the place they had reached was capable of doing things to men that no military training had considered necessary to prepare them for. Rogge observed that the problem was no longer only the climate or the isolation. In recent days, small incidents had begun to occur that did not fit the usual routine of the Atlantis. The death of sailor Bernhard Herrmann came without warning. Herrmann, a 21-year-old gunner born in Schnellewalde, Silesia, whose crew records list him as deceased on December 29, 1940, died while performing maintenance work on the exterior of the ship. In the Atlantis records, his death is listed as a work accident under service conditions. Gunnery officer Lorenz Kasch, who supervised the maintenance that day, reported it to Rogge. Burying Bernhard Herrmann in the Kerguelen Islands required 3 hours of work through a layer of frozen ground whose hardness turned the task into an exhausting effort for the 6 sailors assigned to it. The grave reached 70 centimeters before striking solid basalt rock. Rogge read a prayer. First Officer Kuhn recorded the exact coordinates for the report he would send to the Seekriegsleitung, and the crew returned to the ship. It was the first death of the Atlantis on solid ground. Herrmann is buried in what naval historians have described as the southernmost German war grave of World War II. What none of the men who participated in the burial could know was what that grave would reveal decades later. In the austral summer of 1987, a scientific team collected sediment samples in Kerguelen for research on glacial retreat. The field assistant recorded in the expedition's notebook a second anomaly of processed radioactive material, distinct from the main concentration that would be published 2 years later. Next to the coordinate of that secondary anomaly, he wrote in English the words "secondary source" and added an observation the published article did not include. The radiation from that second source originated from below ground, not from surface sediment. It came from something buried. The coordinate of that secondary source coincides with a precision of less than 20 meters with the position the Atlantis navigation records allow to be estimated for Herrmann's grave. When the scientific article was published in 1989, the coordinate of the secondary anomaly did not appear, nor did the observation about the subterranean origin of the radiation. The assistant, contacted years later by a researcher who had compared the original draft with the published article, explained that the expedition director had asked him to remove that section because it complicated the interpretation of the primary data and might generate questions the expedition was not equipped to answer. The director, contacted by the same researcher, said he did not recall giving that instruction. The grave of Bernhard Herrmann has lain buried in Kerguelen's basalt since December 29, 1940. No one has formally requested its exhumation. No one has explained why it emits radiation. The weeks in Kerguelen had begun to reveal that the Atlantis mission had more layers than any operations order had described, and the last of those layers was about to emerge from the water. What were the lead boxes that the Japanese submarine transferred to the Atlantis in the secret exchange at Kerguelen hiding? The signal arrived on the 17th day of the stay in the archipelago. The Atlantis radio operators maintained constant monitoring of the frequencies assigned by the Seekriegsleitung for high-level encrypted communications. This time they received a sequence of numerical groups unlike the usual ones, longer in its opening block and bearing an authentication indicator that operator Adolf Wenzel, who had spent 17 months working with the ship's communication systems, took several minutes to locate in the reference manuals, as it corresponded to a protocol he had never needed to use throughout the mission. The key used to decrypt the message was not the standard Kriegsmarine cipher, but a diplomatic variant that the Atlantis carried in its codebooks by explicit instruction of the German Foreign Ministry, an irregularity in itself. The decrypted message that Wenzel delivered to Rogge 40 minutes after its original reception contained instructions unlike any operational order Rogge had received up to that point. It did not come from the Kriegsleitung, but from a channel whose seal identified it as a higher authority within the Reich's chain of command without specifying name or position, a practice that in the German bureaucracy of 1941 unequivocally indicated that the instruction originated from one of the security or intelligence bodies operating parallel to conventional military structures. The Atlantis was to remain in position for an additional 48 hours. It would receive a visit from an Allied Axis unit. The exact nature of that unit was not specified, but the geographical context left few possibilities open. In the southern Indian Ocean in 1941, the Axis allies capable of operating at those latitudes without refueling stops were very few. There is a detail in that message that the partially declassified documents of the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg do not explain, and which Ulrich Mohr himself, Rogge's adjutant and author of the most detailed memoirs of the Atlantis mission, describes with a vagueness uncharacteristic of his style elsewhere in the text. Mohr writes that Rogge read the decrypted message twice, slipped it inside his tunic without commenting on it to anyone for the next 4 hours, and summoned communications officer Wenzel and late arrival technician Karl Brenner that same night for a meeting about which Mohr was not informed and which he did not attend. What Rogge, Wenzel and Brenner discussed in that meeting was not recorded in any accessible ship's log. What remained was the consequence. From that night onward, Brenner began operating the radio equipment during the early morning watches independently, without Wenzel's supervision, which until then had been standard procedure for any non-routine transmission. The submarine surfaced at dawn on the second day of waiting, under visibility conditions reduced by the Kerguelen fog to less than 200 meters. It was an I-class submarine of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the long-range type Japan had developed throughout the 1930s precisely to operate in the world's most remote oceans with an autonomy unmatched by contemporary European designs. The Imperial Navy's I-class submarines were the largest in the world in 1941, with a submerged displacement exceeding 2,000 tons and an operational range of between 20 and 25,000 nautical miles without refueling, nearly double that of the best German U-boats of the time. The silhouette emerging from the mist bore the characteristic proportions of those vessels, significantly larger than any U-boat, with an elongated conning tower housing the hangar for a Yokosuka E-14Y reconnaissance aircraft. Its deckline, as sailors of the Atlantis observing from their stations along the rail described in fragments of private correspondence that survived the destruction protocol, seemed as though it did not belong to the same ocean as they did. What a submarine of the Imperial Japanese Navy was doing in the sub-Antarctic waters of the Indian Ocean, more than 5,000 nautical miles from the nearest Japanese naval base capable of dispatching it, was a question whose answer lay inside the sealed boxes its sailors began transferring to the Atlantis by inflatable Zodiac over the next 2 hours. And also, though this would not become clear until much later, in the passengers the submarine carried aboard, because the I-class had not arrived with cargo alone. It had arrived with people. This detail does not appear in the version of the encounter that Mohr described in his published memoirs, nor does it appear in the declassified fragments of the Atlantis archives that the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv made available to researchers beginning in the 1990s. It appears instead in a source that for decades no one connected to the Kerguelen meeting. An internal note from the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, dated February 1942, found among the archives captured by Allied forces in Tokyo in 1945 and transferred to the archive of the United States Department of State, where it remained catalogued under a generic reference to Japanese wartime files without any researcher identifying it in that context. Until German historian Dieter Krause in his 1994 monograph pointed out the existence of Japanese documentation describing a naval contact with German forces in the southern Indian Ocean in the autumn of 1941. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs note does not detail the nature of the passengers. It uses the expression liaison technicians, a designation sufficiently vague to avoid specifying their institutional origin, and mentions that the contact took place at the coordinates of the Kerguelen archipelago with satisfactory results for both parties. Who were the liaison technicians? The answer that the available fragments allow us to construct points toward the joint technical exchange program that Germany and Japan had established through their naval missions in Berlin and Tokyo since the late 1930s. That program included the periodic dispatch of technical officers and scientists between the two powers to facilitate the transfer of knowledge in specific areas of weapons development. In 1941, one of the areas of greatest interest for exchange was precisely the one represented by the crates bearing the RSHA seal stored in the basalt caves of Kerguelen. The materials and knowledge associated with the nuclear physics research programs that both powers had launched with varying degrees of progress and with such strict internal compartmentalization that even the participants themselves did not always have a complete picture of what the other side was contributing to the exchange. The exchange that took place in the waters of Kerguelen that dawn was, in terms of what the archives allow us to reconstruct, one of the most significant episodes of technical collaboration between the Axis powers and also one of the least documented. Germany transferred to Japan complete blueprints of its jet engine program, including the technical specifications of the Junkers Jumo 004 engine, which the Japanese aviation program had been attempting to develop for years without overcoming the high-temperature turbine difficulties. In return, Japan delivered to Germany a shipment that later German documents describe as material for the special program, an expression that in the bureaucratic vocabulary of the Reich in 1941 was reserved for materials related to experimental weapons projects. The numbered lead boxes that Japanese sailors transferred to the Zodiac and from there to the Atlantis contained 50 kilograms of uranium oxide from the mines Japan controlled in the occupied territories of Manchuria. The material had been purified to a level of concentration that did not correspond to any conventional industrial use of uranium. In 1941, uranium was used primarily as a coloring agent in ceramic glazes and in the manufacture of certain types of specialized glass. The purification profile of the material contained in the lead boxes did not match any of those uses. The unusual thickness of the lead containers, the numbering system corresponding to the classification protocols for radioactive materials standardized by the German Uranverein, the so-called Uranium Club, for shipments between laboratories, and Rogge's explicit instruction not to inventory the cargo in the ship's standard records were indicators precise enough for any nuclear physicist in 1941. The sailors of the Atlantis were not nuclear physicists, they were sailors. They loaded the boxes without special handling instructions, stored them in the forward hold alongside other cargo, and resumed their routines. No one in the ship's immediate chain of command informed them of the specific nature of the material they had just taken aboard. Rogge's instructions were generic: classified material, restricted access, do not inventory in standard cargo records. The Kriegsleitung had not deemed it necessary, or perhaps had not considered it advisable, to provide additional instructions regarding the specific risks of the contents. If Rogge knew exactly what he was carrying in his holds, he did not share that information with Meinecke, the ship's physician. The first signs appeared 3 weeks after the loading. Sanitätsoffizier Karl Meinecke began receiving sailors in his infirmary with symptoms that did not correspond to any of the usual clinical patterns in a crew subjected to the conditions of southern latitudes: persistent nausea without vomiting, hair loss in proportions the affected men described as entire clumps left on their pillows during sleep, and a fatigue that did not subside with rest, and that the sailors described not as muscular exhaustion but as a depletion that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the muscles. Meinecke, trained in conventional naval medicine without specialization in what in 1941 was not yet even called radiological medicine, initially diagnosed the symptoms as a consequence of prolonged stress and continuous exposure to the southern cold. The affected men were precisely those who had participated in loading and storing the lead boxes, those who had handled the containers directly, those who worked in the section of the hold where they were stored, and to a lesser extent, those who spent time on adjacent decks. The uranium oxide emitted radiation in amounts that, in brief and isolated exposure, would not have produced observable clinical effects in the short term. But sustained proximity over weeks, in confined spaces with limited ventilation, had begun to produce effects that nuclear physics would describe decades later as chronic low-dose radiation syndrome, a silent, cumulative damage that did not manifest with the immediate violence of acute irradiation, but with the corrosive persistence of something the body could not repair at the rate the damage was occurring. As the Atlantis continued its mission, small signals accumulated over weeks began forming a recognizable pattern. Thousands of kilometers away, analysts and intelligence operators were slowly reconstructing its position. In the next segment, we will see how they managed to locate the Atlantis and what triggered the decisive shift in the operation. When did Rogge realize that his ship was being followed, and how did the Allies manage to find the Atlantis without attacking it directly? In the spring of 1941, the cryptographers at Bletchley Park were working under constant pressure. Deciphering a message encoded by the Enigma machine was not a quick process, but a systematic elimination of possibilities. To accelerate it, Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman had designed the electromechanical bombs, machines capable of performing in minutes checks that would have taken a human cryptographer weeks. Even so, each message remained a race against time. Decryption could require hours or even days, and when the result was finally obtained, the information had often lost part of its operational value. During the first 2 years of the war, the Royal Navy's meteorological intelligence system had developed a sufficiently precise understanding of the transmission patterns of German weather ships, the Wetterschiffe, to identify the distinctive characteristics of their radio emissions, including frequency, transmission power, interval between messages, and the encoding format of atmospheric data. When in the spring of 1941, a signals intelligence analyst detected a sequence of meteorological transmissions originating from coordinates in the southern Indian Ocean, at latitudes where no German weather ship should have been, the anomaly did not trigger an emergency alert. Instead, it entered the standard process of verification and analysis that Bletchley Park applied to all transmissions of uncertain origin. What made the transmission unusual was not only its geographical origin, but its content. The meteorological data transmitted from those coordinates were extraordinarily precise for a point in the ocean that the Allied observation network considered virtually a dead zone, with no friendly ships within an 800-mile radius and no land-based weather stations within 2,000. Such precision was only possible if the transmitter possessed professional-grade meteorological instruments and remained stationary, or nearly stationary, at those coordinates for prolonged periods. A vessel in transit did not generate meteorological data with such consistency. Someone was anchored or navigating in very tight circles at the southern edge of the Indian Ocean. The Ultra Network, the integrated system for exploiting German signals intelligence that the British Admiralty had built upon the successes of Bletchley Park, took 6 weeks to produce a position estimate precise enough to be considered of operational value. The Allied response was not what any conventional naval planner would have recommended. A bombardment or direct naval raid would have destroyed whatever installation the Atlantis had established in the archipelago, but it would also have revealed that the Allies had located the vessel through signals analysis, alerting the Kriegsmarine to a vulnerability in its communications. The operation the Admiralty designed instead did not appear in conventional naval operations plans. Its official designation, Operation Tabarin, was recorded in the archives under a level of secrecy that was not partially lifted until decades later, and the nature of the contingent deployed to carry it out did not correspond to any of the units the Royal Navy hierarchy would have selected for a naval combat mission. The men recruited for Operation Tabarin were, for the most part, Norwegian. Norway had fallen under German occupation in April 1940. In the months that followed, thousands of Norwegian military personnel and civilians crossed the North Sea to join Allied forces in Great Britain. Their experience in navigation and operations in extreme climates brought valuable capabilities to the joint effort. Among these, the most relevant was practical knowledge of the sub-Arctic environment and polar climate accumulated over generations of navigation, fishing and whaling operations in the seas of northern Norway, in the waters of the North Atlantic, and in the case of crews from the Norwegian whaling fleet in the southern latitudes where Norway had maintained for decades the most productive whaling fleet in the world. The Norwegian harpooners incorporated into Operation Tabarin's contingent were men who had spent entire seasons in the waters of Kerguelen, the South Shetland Islands and South Georgia, who knew southern meteorology not from climatological theory but from the physical experience of enduring it for months, who could read cloud formations and the direction of the polar wind. Some of them knew the hidden coves and bays of Kerguelen in sufficient detail to navigate toward them in zero visibility, using the sound of waves against the cliffs as an acoustic navigation system. The tracking began with residue analysis. The Norwegian harpooners, who had worked for years in waters where the presence of ships was detected by smell before sight, knew that a warship left a persistent chemical trace in the water. Machinery oil that inevitably seeped through hull joints, bilge water residues regularly pumped overboard, the hydrocarbon film produced during refueling operations. In the conditions of Kerguelen's waters, where circumpolar currents slowly disperse these residues in predictable spirals, an experienced tracker could estimate the direction of origin of the contamination with a precision that surprised the British naval officers supervising the operation. Combined with radio frequency analysis, which Operation Tabarin's operators monitored from a provisional station established on the coast of Kerguelen in the first weeks of the mission, the tracking of chemical residues produced a location that reduced the search area to a specific bay on the west coast of the main island within 10 days. The shadow war that followed on the glaciers and cliffs was not documented in the official operation reports with the detail its executors deserved. What the archives record is a series of sabotage and neutralization operations against the installations the Atlantis had established ashore, carried out over several weeks with minimal casualties among the Allied contingent and progressively more severe effects on the commerce raiders' operational capacity. The files do not describe the nights when Norwegian trackers lay motionless atop basalt peaks for hours, their bodies pressed against the rock to eliminate any visible silhouette, waiting for the movement of a figure on the deck of a vessel barely discernible through the fog 400 meters away. They do not describe the night when one of those trackers fired a single shot in crosswinds and sub-zero temperatures and did not miss. They do not describe the operation in which 2 members of the contingent entered the water at 2 degrees above freezing, swam to the hull of the Atlantis, located in darkness the ballast purge valves accessible from outside the hull, and injected seawater into the ship's ballast tanks with the methodical precision of men who had rehearsed the procedure dozens of times in less lethal waters. The seawater froze in the following hours, expanding and jamming the valve systems while stressing the propulsion piping connections, creating minor but cumulative breakdowns that the Atlantis engine crew took days to diagnose. But there was one night when the operation nearly ended in an entirely different way. According to an internal note from the Tabarin contingent preserved in the restricted holdings of the Public Record Office at Kiel on a date recorded in the files as the 3rd week of operations, one of the Norwegian trackers was captured by a patrol of Atlantis sailors during a nighttime incursion on the coast. The man, identified in the note only as Operator N, had penetrated too close to the ship's perimeter while attempting to install a listening device on the basalt rock from which the contingent monitored German radio transmissions. The patrol intercepted him before he could withdraw. What occurred in the following hours is not described in any declassified document, but the outcome is recorded in a single line in the same log. Operator N returned to camp in the early hours of the following day. No further explanation, no mention of how it had been possible. The operator gave no details to his superiors. What was recorded is that from that night onward, the contingent modified its incursion procedures and reduced its operational perimeter. Someone aboard the Atlantis had seen something, and what he had seen had told him they were not alone in Kerguelen. Rogge understood before the pattern became unmistakable that something in the environment had changed. The incidents his engineers interpreted as consequences of natural wear were too specific, too consistently affecting critical systems, and occurred with a regularity that exceeded any statistical probability of accident. The Atlantis was not suffering the effects of the Southern Ocean. It was being dismantled piece by piece by someone who knew it well enough to know exactly how to act. And now Rogge knew it even if he could not prove it. How did the mission of the Atlantis end, and what happened during its final confrontation with the British cruiser Devonshire? The decision to attempt escape was made in the final hours of October 1941. The meeting in the chart room lasted 4 hours. The propulsion systems had suffered cumulative damage that reduced the ship's maximum speed to less than 70% of its nominal capacity. Spare parts were exhausted, and at least 16 crew members showed physical deterioration that Sanitätsoffizier Meinecke continued to describe in his official reports as chronic fatigue. In private conversations with Rogge, however, He had begun to speak with a frankness his written reports avoided. These were men who were fading without any identifiable cause at a rate that did not correspond to any illness he had treated before. To remain was to wait for a capture engineered with patience. To leave meant facing the open sea with a damaged vessel and a partially incapacitated crew. Before ordering departure, Rogge activated Protocol Verbrannte Erde, the Scorched Earth Protocol. The basalt caves where Atlantis had stored supplies for weeks were destroyed with explosive charges placed at structural points identified during their stay. The cave where the lead crates had been kept received an additional charge. The documentary archive accumulated over 17 months of operations was burned in the onboard incinerator during 4 hours of continuous work. The jet engine blueprints exchanged with the Japanese submarine, the records of the uranium cargo, and thousands of feet of 16mm film shot by the intelligence officer at Kerguelen, including footage of the irradiated sailors no one had been able to explain, and which no one would now see. That night, the intelligence officer wrote in his diary that destroying those records did not erase the events they documented. It only erased the evidence that someone in the Reich had considered those events important enough to order them carried out. The whiteout arrived before Atlantis had completed its exit from the main bay. Ensign Georg Steinhoff navigated the first 2 hours of the escape using only sonar and gyroscopic data, calculating each course correction based on elapsed time and estimated speed. A 2-degree error could place the ship in the path of an iceberg large enough to split it in two before sonar detected it with any margin for maneuver. The sonar remained silent. But in open sea, the absence of signals could mean either isolation or the proximity of something not yet within range. That encounter came on the second day of navigation, when the silhouette of the cruiser HMS Devonshire emerged from the fog off the starboard quarter. Its course had been calculated to intercept Atlantis at an angle that left no room for maneuver in any direction without exposing her broadside or stern to the fire of its 6-inch guns. The signal it transmitted was direct: stop engines and identify yourself. Rogge ordered the camouflage panels removed. For the last time in Atlantis's operational life, steel plates slid aside to reveal the artillery that had remained concealed for 17 months. The ship that had sailed under dozens of different identities revealed its true nature to an adversary who already knew exactly who it was. The first shells from Devonshire struck Atlantis's superstructure before her guns could establish an effective rate of fire. Within the first minutes, one of the forward turrets was disabled and 2 men were killed on deck, unreachable as continuous fire kept exposed positions under shell impact. Atlantis responded with the guns that remained operational, and some of her shells struck Devonshire. But the merchant hull had never been designed to absorb heavy naval artillery, and each British hit inflicted damage that Atlantis's return fire could not offset. A shell struck Atlantis's forward hold. Instead of the orange flash and black smoke that accompany the detonation of a shell inside a ship's hold, the explosion produced for an instant a bluish-green luminescence that spread through the entry hole and out of the open deck hatches. It was visible from Devonshire 3 miles away, even in the fog at the end of the whiteout. It lasted between 3 and 5 seconds. None of the observers had words to name it. Devonshire's gunnery officer described it in his subsequent report as an unidentified phenomenon, possibly related to chemical reactions of cargo in the hold upon contact with the shell's fire. The phrase unidentified remained in the report because it was the only honest term available in 1941. The physics that would have explained that luminescence would not be publicly formulated until the Manhattan Project completed its work. By then, Atlantis had already been resting for 3 years at the bottom of the Indian Ocean. Atlantis sank 10 minutes after the firing ceased. Rogge was the last to abandon ship. From the water, surrounded by survivors clinging to lifeboats and debris thrown into the sea by the explosion, he watched the bow sink first, with a slowness that did not correspond to the visible damage to the hull. Then the deck, and finally the stern, the propeller rising clear of the water. Kriegsmarine protocols established that commerce raiders operated with support submarines across broad ocean areas. One of them was close enough to receive the distress call. The submarine U-126 reached the position while Devonshire still remained in the area. For 40 minutes, The commander of the German Type 9C submarine maneuvered on the surface among the survivors scattered in the water, exposed without protection to the guns of the British cruiser, retrieving men from lifeboats and floating wreckage one by one. The men of U-126 leaned over the deck to pull bodies from the ocean. Devonshire did not open fire. Shortly afterward, it withdrew from the area without attempting to prevent the rescue. The exact reasons were never clearly recorded in the archives of the British Admiralty. Among those who did not reach the lifeboats were several of the sailors who had handled the lead crates in the holds at Kerguelen. Their names appear in Atlantis's records as missing in action. The documents include no reference to their physical condition in the days preceding the sinking. The lead crates now rested on the floor of the southern Indian Ocean, 3,000 meters deep alongside the wreck of the ship and part of the archives that the incinerator had failed to destroy completely. In darkness and under extreme pressure, the metal began a slow and inevitable process of corrosion. What survived in the documents allowed the general outlines of the story to be reconstructed, but it was not enough to answer every question. The 50 kilograms of uranium oxide disappeared with Atlantis, and with them, part of the history slipped beyond the reach of the archives. What happened to the survivors of the Atlantis after the sinking of the ship? The war ended for the Atlantis on November 22, 1941, but it did not end for the men who had crewed her. The U-126 towed the survivors' boats for 2 days in the South Atlantic. 300 men distributed among wooden lifeboats and rubber rafts under an equatorial sun that by day reached temperatures incompatible with prolonged exposure and nights that dropped to levels the wounded could not endure without medical attention. Sanitätsoffizier Meinecker performed operations on wet wood with the instruments he had managed to retrieve from the ship before abandoning her. On November 24th, the Python arrived. It was a German supply ship operating in the South Atlantic, refueling submarines. The 400 survivors of the Atlantis came aboard. Rogge assembled his officers and reported on the condition of the crew. The wounded were transferred to the infirmary. The men Meinecker had been monitoring were placed in cabins. For the first time in days, there was hot water and food. It lasted 9 days. On December 1, 1941, HMS Dorsetshire found the Python refueling U-126 and UA in waters south of St. Helena. The Dorsetshire was the sister ship of the Devonshire, the same class of heavy cruiser with the same 8-inch guns that had sunk the Atlantis 9 days earlier. The commander of the Python ordered the ship abandoned and scuttled before the Dorsetshire opened fire. The 400 survivors of the Atlantis, who had spent 2 days in boats and 9 days aboard the Python, found themselves back in the water once again. The Dorsetshire did not fire on the survivors. It withdrew from the area after seeing the Python sink, just as the Devonshire had withdrawn without firing on U-126 9 days earlier. Neither British commander explained that decision in their reports in any way that went beyond standard protocol. The 4 German submarines operating in the South Atlantic picked up the survivors of both sinkings. Each submarine took approximately 100 men aboard. The rest were distributed among 10 lifeboats that the submarines towed. Under those conditions, with Italian submarines arriving as reinforcement and assuming part of the transport, the improvised flotilla set course for France. The survivors of the Atlantis reached Saint-Nazaire between December 25, 1941, and January 3, 1942. They had been shipwrecked twice in 10 days. They had spent weeks distributed among boats, rafts, submarine decks, and cabins under conditions no naval survival manual had ever designed for such duration or such an accumulation of circumstances. Rogge disembarked on Christmas Eve. On December 29th, he assembled his crew in a local cathedral. Among those who disembarked in Saint-Nazaire were several of the men Meinecker had observed in Kerguelen with symptoms he did not know how to name. They were processed as shipwreck survivors, granted leave and sent home. Rogge spent the rest of the war in Germany. He reached the rank of Vice-Admiral. He was not arrested by the Allies after Germany's capitulation in May 1945, a fact that, in the context of the immediate post-war period, when virtually all senior Kriegsmarine officers were detained and interrogated, was unusual enough to generate comments among the Allied officers overseeing the process. The documented reason was the testimony of the British prisoners the Atlantis had captured during her mission. Captain Armstrong White, commander of the city of Baghdad, sunk by the Atlantis in July 1940, declared before Allied authorities that the treatment received aboard the commerce raider had left respect rather than hatred. That statement, and others like it from British prisoners who had spent weeks aboard the Atlantis before being transferred to other ships, constructed a profile of Rogge that Allied authorities considered incompatible with that of a war criminal. What those statements could not include, because the men making them did not know it, was the certificate Rogge had been required to request during the war in order to remain on active duty. It was a procedure the administration of the Third Reich applied to officers whose family trees included ancestors classified as problematic under the racial legislation then in force. Rogge had a Jewish grandfather. Without the certificate of German blood that the system demanded and granted him, he would not have been able to continue in command of the Atlantis. That fact does not appear in his memoirs published in 1955 under the title Ship 16, nor in the 1957 English translation under the title Under 10 Flags. It was documented decades later in files from the Bundesarchiv that processed the administrative records of Kriegsmarine officers. Rogge died on June 29, 1982 in Rheinbeck, Germany, without ever mentioning that fact publicly in any interview or in any of his later writings. Rogge's memoirs and the parallel book written by his officer Ulrich Mohr in collaboration with the journalist Selwood described the mission of the Atlantis with the detail two direct witnesses could provide: the ships sunk, the identities adopted, the camouflage operations, the stay in Kerguelen, and the encounter with the Devonshire. Mohr's memoir described the grounding at Kerguelen with enough detail for readers to understand that the archipelago had been more than a technical stopover. It described the geography of the bays, the conditions of the repair work, the life of the crew during the weeks of their stay. It did not describe the cargo of the Japanese submarine. It did not describe the sailors' symptoms. It did not describe the lead boxes. Rogge's memoirs and Mohr's were precise and detailed accounts of exactly what their authors had decided they should contain. In 1955, the same year Rogge published his memoirs, retired seaman Otto Schiemann, who had served as a sonar operator aboard the Atlantis throughout the entire mission, published a memoir with a small publishing house in Bremen. The book was titled Südpole and sold fewer than 2,000 copies before disappearing from catalogues. Schiemann devoted 3 chapters to the stay in Kerguelen with a level of detail that exceeded what Rogge and Mohr had included about that period. He described the symptoms he and several shipmates had developed during the weeks of storing the Japanese submarine's cargo. He did not use the word uranium, he used the expression the special material, which was exactly the term the sailors of the Atlantis had heard the officers use. His descriptions of the symptoms were precise enough that any reader in 1955 who had followed public coverage of the effects of nuclear testing in the Pacific would recognize what Schiemann was describing without it being named. The book was purchased, as documented decades later in an investigation by the Naval History Archive in Kiel, by exactly 14 people in the first years after publication. One of them was an official from the Bundesnachrichtendienst who brought the book to his superiors and received in response a non-circulation instruction that was noted in the file. Schiemann died in 1971 at 59 years of age of pancreatic carcinoma recorded by physicians as idiopathic, of unknown origin, with no identifiable conventional risk factors. In 1987, Swedish glaciologist Anders Lindqvist visited Kerguelen as part of a multinational scientific expedition under the International Antarctic Program. Lindqvist was not researching World War II. He was measuring glacial retreat rates for comparative data with Arctic records. The methodology included sampling sediments from the bottom of glacial lagoons, where annual deposits of material carried by meltwater formed a stratigraphic archive readable year by year. In samples from a lagoon on the west coast of Kerguelen, Lindqvist found a concentration of uranium oxide particles in the stratum corresponding to the year 1941 that had no explanation in any of the natural deposition models known to his team. It was not uranium of geological origin, it was uranium processed and purified by industrial means, deposited in the environment of that lagoon at some point during that year. Lindqvist published the data in 1989 in a specialized geochemistry journal. The article described the anomaly without explaining it and did not mention World War II because Lindqvist had not connected his data to any historical event from that period. The specialized scientific community did not make the connection either. The field notebook of Lindqvist's expedition assistant, preserved in the archives of the Meteorological and Geological Institute of Gothenburg, contains a notation that does not appear in the published article. It describes a secondary anomaly of processed radioactive material approximately 40 meters from the main concentration in the 1941 stratum, in a position where the sediment would not show that profile according to standard hydric dispersion models. The secondary anomaly did not originate in surface sediment. It originated underground. The coordinates of that secondary anomaly coincide with an accuracy of less than 20 meters, with the coordinates First Officer Erich Kuhn recorded in the Atlantis navigation logs on December 29, 1940, when he noted the exact position of the burial of Seaman Bernhard. Hermann's grave has stood in the basalt of Kerguelen since December 29, 1940. No one has formally requested its exhumation. No one has officially explained why it emits radiation. Historian Dieter Krause, a researcher at the University of Hamburg, published in 1994 a monograph on the Kriegsmarine commerce raiders in which he reconstructed the Atlantis' stay in Kerguelen using fragments of declassified archives, Schieman's book, and the data from Lindqvist's article. Krause was the first to explicitly propose the connection between Lindqvist's data and the presence of the Atlantis in Kerguelen in 1941. The monograph generated, in a manner Krause did not learn about until years later, an internal inquiry at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg regarding documents related to the cargo described in the appendix. Recently, a Franco-Australian oceanographic expedition conducted a systematic survey of the seabed in waters off Kerguelen using a remotely operated vehicle equipped with geochemical sensors. The sensors recorded, at depths between 2,800 and 3,200 meters, anomalies consistent with the presence of corroded steel structures on the ocean floor and above those structures, radioactivity levels compatible with the presence of radioactive material. The report was sent to French authorities as the sovereign power over the archipelago and to the International Atomic Energy Agency. The preliminary assessment recommended periodic monitoring. The report was not made public and the coordinates were not released. The KMS Atlantis rests on the floor of the southern Indian Ocean. Its guns are still partially recognizable amid the corrosion. Its hull is split in two by the impact of the Devonshire's final shell. In its holds remain fragments of an archive the incinerator did not completely destroy, mixed with the remains of 80 years of pressure and darkness. If the lead boxes of the Atlantis still lie on the floor of the Indian Ocean and radiation was detected in 2019, why has no one publicly demanded an explanation? What exactly did the Reich know about the effects of that material on people? Rogge published his memoirs in 1955, describing every detail of the mission except the Kerguelen cargo. What prevented him from mentioning it?